I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm going to give you some practical steps for interrupting implicit bias. There are hundreds of lab studies in social psychology labs in universities documenting the same patterns of bias over and over again for the past 40 years. But one of the questions that I ask myself, and other people have also asked, is do these lab studies actually describe what goes on at work? So about 5 years ago, I set out to find out. I interviewed a group of highly successful women. These were not women who had dropped out. These are women who had reached the peaks of their careers, and asked them, I did a very simple protocol. I simply described to them the findings of social psychologist lab studies, and I asked them, any of that sound familiar? I was really surprised when 96% said yes. So 96% of the women had met one or more of the 4 basic patterns of gender bias. The other thing I did is I broke this huge literature down into 4 distinct patterns, and I'll be talking them through with you today. As you can see, the incidence of bias differs by pattern. And then what I did, the next step was I interviewed women of color in STEM and got a very fine-grained description of how these patterns of bias differ by race. I'm not going to talk about that very much today because there's not time. The next step actually is to integrate this huge literature on gender bias with the literature on racial bias, and that is actually the most recent work that I've done through what's called the Bias Interrupters Working Group. Won't be talking about that today either. What we will be focusing on today is to give you really practical steps for recognizing and interrupting bias. Now, this is often called unconscious bias. It's more accurate to call it automatic because the associations driven by stereotypes take place automatically. But although the stereotype activation is automatic, stereotype application can be controlled, and that's what I'm going to teach you to do today. This is particularly important for STEM because studies show that organizations that believe themselves to be meritocratic typically show higher levels of bias. And people who believe they are colorblind typically show more racial bias. And in one study found that men evaluated gender bias research much more negatively than women, and this was particularly true of men in STEM. So STEM, in many ways, is a pretty challenging context. Okay, here's the first of the 4 patterns. I call it prove it again. 2/3 of the women I interviewed reported it, and then the survey we did through the Association for Women in Science of women in STEM, 2/3 of them reported it too. So that's a pretty robust figure. Although, by the way, 77% of black women did. It stems from 2 different mechanisms. The first is called in-group favoritism. The second, lack of fit. Here's in-group favoritism. It stems from the nature of social networks. This is a sociological literature. What do you think is the most important factor in determining who you have in your network? Raise your hand when you agree. Proximity, similarity, attractiveness, social status, diversity. Yeah, it's similarity. You're right. Most people recognize that just intuitively. So in your social network, the strongest determinant typically is similarity. Now, where you have an industry that's typically been dominated by a particular demographic group, this social network effect translates into in-group favoritism for a very specific group. This is really important because it focuses, so much of gender bias literature focuses on the treatment of women, but the action is on the treatment of men. So the in-group favoritism effect has impacts on access to information and opportunities, on sponsorship, and on who gets the benefit of the doubt. Promotions and job openings here seem to be given on a who you know, not a what you know basis. That's a very common form of bias. And these quotes, many of their quotes are from a major STEM research organization. So here, applying that here, when you get DOE funding or LDRD funding, whom do you select to join your team? Is the information on how to get a promotion, performance bonuses, or becoming a distinguished fellow, is that public, or is it passed through informal channels? Because if it's passed through informal channels, then it's going to be passed through social networks, and that's going to have a very concrete effect. And this first issue of who gets invited to join the team when somebody gets a big grant is something that we hear over and over and over again. We're working with a lot of STEM research organizations, and whether they are public or private, who gets invited to join those teams is a huge factor in many of them. That, of course, is a function of this kind of bias. Here's the second, another quote. They make sure their golden boys are the next generation of leaders. Now, who the golden boys are vary, but they're usually golden and they're usually boys. And that is another effect of in-group favoritism. This affects sponsorship. Now, what's sponsorship? It's different from being a mentor. A sponsor is someone who you're willing to spend your political capital to help them advance. That's what a sponsor is. So here are some interrupters. You really should look around and count and make a list of who you are sponsoring. That is a very powerful first step. And then look down. Is there certain demography to that? If you're typical, there is. And in fact, what we see anecdotally again and again is that men tend to sponsor men, and women tend to sponsor about 50-50, men and women. So that's what we typically see. It may not hold here. Another important issue is when you're sponsoring someone, often there's a bleed over between professional and social. And that's one of the ways in which the sponsor bonds with the person that they're sponsoring. So are the activities that you do with the people you are sponsoring, are they comfortable for everybody? Some are, some aren't. Going out to a professional lunch with a group of people you're sponsoring, that's comfortable for everyone. Going to the gym, that's probably going to be a little bit less comfortable. So is drinking beer after 9 p.m. So are those activities comfortable for everyone? Here's the third major effect of in-group favoritism. It concerns how objective rules are applied. Now, you'd think if you had objective rules, you wouldn't have bias, but that's not what the studies show, because objective rules tend to be applied rigorously to outgroups and leniently to in-groups. Here's an example from physics. A woman said, there was a rule in my lab, which I didn't know, that you were supposed to submit your PowerPoints a week before you gave them at a conference for approval. And I didn't know the rule, so the first time I only submitted it 3 days in advance. And then I learned the rule, and after that, I followed the rule. But it got back to me that I was being called that arrogant Yaley who didn't think the rules applied to me because I did it wrong just once. She said, other people always do it wrong. They don't follow the rule to this day. But you notice how the objective rules were being applied rigorously to the outgroup, leniently to the in-group. So who gets the benefit of the doubt? So how do you interrupt this bias, this objective rules applied rigorously, leniently? It's very important when you have objective rules, and we'll see later why it's important to have them, to make sure that they're applied consistently. If you waive them, watch yourself do that. Is there a demography for when it seems appropriate to do so? You have to check for consistency in hiring, promotions, raises, all of it. If you bend the rules, be mindful. And keep in mind, this is driven by the very human thing of just identifying with people who are like you. Oh, he is brilliant, and I know he's brash, but I was that way, and look how good I turned out, right? That's behind a lot of this. Here's the second mechanism behind the prove it again effect. It's called lack of fit. This is Barbara Bars. This is Ben Bars. They're the same person. And Ben said, some people even think my research is better now. Shortly after I changed sex, a faculty colleague said, Ben Bars gave a great seminar today, but then his work is so much better than his sister's. And you would think that an academic presentation on neuroscience would be objective, if anything could be. But this bias is the bias that takes place at a cognitive level. So we can see how strong it is. So if you don't fit the stereotype, you're not going to be taken seriously, said one woman. Again, this was in a STEM context. And here's a study of what's called double standards in the academic, again in a STEM context. Women postdocs needed to be twice as productive to receive the same competency rating. And a female scientist needs 64 more impact points than a male to be seen as equally competent. That means 3 extra papers in Nature or Science, or 20 in less prestigious journals. These are very concrete, measurable effects. One of the ways this plays out is that women's successes are coded very differently than men's. This is actually from our study of women of color in STEM. She said, when I came up, when I came up for full professor, there was this big discussion about whether I would continue to do the things that I already had been doing once I got full professor. She said, I'd never heard that kind of comment. It was a double standard. And that's actually what it's called in the literature, double standards. You notice how she needed to provide much more evidence of competence than equivalent men in order to be seen as eligible for full professor. Women's mistakes are also coded very differently. And I should mention, all of these prove it again, they're race gender. So everything I'm saying about gender is also triggered by race. Women's mistakes tend to be noticed more and remembered longer. So this was a statistician. She said, you know, a colleague of mine hasn't been able to let go of a mistake that another woman colleague of ours made years ago. She said, but he's been extraordinarily lenient with a male colleague who has done worse. Again, naturally then, the women have to provide more evidence of competence if their mistakes are going to be weighted more heavily. This also plays out in recommendation letters. One study found that men tend to get long, enthusiastic letters with comments on their research, abilities, and careers, and women tend to get much shorter letters with more doubt raisers, with comments on their training, teaching, and diligence. Now, raise your hand the last time you hired someone because of their diligence. Again, another study found that controlling for qualifications, men tend to get more standout adjectives, unique, exceptional, outstanding, than women do, women with identical qualifications. So you're sitting on a search committee, and you see this playing out. You see men being judged on their potential, women on their performance. How do you intervene? You can say very mildly, you know, I think we finally realized what we're looking for in this position. It's someone with A, B, and C. So let's go back to the top of the pile and make sure we've picked up everyone who has those things. You don't have to call out bias. You don't have to do anything except for just say, let's go back to the top of the pile. And if that doesn't work, you might have to do something that may be a one step up, which is, can you help me understand how this situation is different from Jim's? And you'll see that's a question that's often helpful. This is a punch cartoon. That's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Trigg. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. This concerns meeting dynamics. It's what we call the stolen idea. And just based on my audiences, about 3/4 of professional women have encountered it and encountered it often. It's one of the ideas that's really taken off from the book that I wrote with my daughter, Rachel Dempsey, who's now a clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And Rachel calls it the stolen idea. What do you do when you see it? So you're sitting in a team meeting and you see it happen. What can you say? You can say, you know, I've been thinking about that idea ever since Pam first said it. You've added something important. Here's the next step. So you notice how you can call out the bias and you don't have to embarrass anyone. You don't have to say you're calling out bias. All you need to do is to establish a norm where when that happens, somebody will say very mildly, you know, that came from X, you've added something important, here's why. Here's the second of the 4 patterns. It's called the tightrope, and as you can see, it's the most common pattern. And that's important because in the types of bias trainings that have been commonplace for the last 10 years based on the implicit association test, this pattern is never even mentioned. It stems from prescriptive stereotypes. Studies again and again and again show that women are expected to be nice and communal, helpful, modest, sympathetic, interpersonally sensitive. Men are expected to be something quite different. They're expected to be competent and agentic, assertive, competitive, ambitious leaders. Those prescriptive stereotypes have profound effects in today's workplace. First of all, they have profound effects on men and on establishing male norms. After the meeting, they all went out for beer. Things got pretty informal. I felt uncomfortable and excluded. Now, if you're in an environment that has been male from the beginning, it's obvious that the social patterns are designed around what's expected to be appropriate for men. And so you have male norms, and women may not feel as comfortable in them because they're not as socially appropriate for women. These prescriptive stereotypes have profound effects on men in another way. Men tend to interrupt women far more than vice versa. Why? It's socially appropriate for men to interrupt. He's just showing you he's competitive and ambitious. A woman who interrupts, not so much. Ben Barr said, you know, by far the biggest difference is that people now treat me with far more respect. I can even complete a whole sentence, he said, without being interrupted by a man, as someone who has lived in both skins as a scientist. So you're in a committee meeting, and you see that women are being interrupted far more than men. How do you intervene? Well, you can say something like, Susan, I think you had a thought there. Eager to hear you finish, but eager to hear your thought, but let's let Susan finish first. And you can readily imagine that if everybody in an environment is doing that, not in an aggressive way, but just in a very matter-of-fact way, this pattern would disappear almost immediately. And it's such an important pattern to interrupt. And I can see that because it's really a social hierarchy pattern. And as someone who has run an organization now for 15 years, if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you have to really be careful that you're not in an echo chamber. Because if you don't signal that other people can speak up, they won't. And if you didn't want to hear from them, why did you hire them? I hire people because I respect their competence. I don't want to silence them. Other ideas are talk to the interrupter offline, establish a no interrupter rule, assign people to speak or report on specific issues, allow people to contribute after the meeting, circulate the agenda beforehand. And many of these changes will not only help women, they'll help Asian Americans, they'll help people who grew up in a blue-collar background, and they will help men who are introverts because they are less likely to be out there jumping in. Here's another way the tightrope plays out. It's in terms of pressure to behave in feminine ways, pressure to be the office mom or the dutiful daughter who aligns with a brilliant man but never threatens him, or to engage in what sociologists call organizational citizenship behavior. Women do more of it, they get less credit when they do it. This is what Rachel calls doing the office housework. It consists actually of 4 quite different sorts of things. One is literal housework. Who plans the holiday party? Another is administrative work. Are women more likely to take notes or organize talks? The third is emotion work, mentoring, for example. And then the fourth is undervalued work, work that's actually important work, but just kind of isn't the glamour work in this environment. So working with postdocs, developing internal administrative policies, putting together an itinerary for the visiting scientist or DOE officials, going to lunch with interviewees, serving on committees. All of that's really important work, but I suspect if this is a characteristic STEM research organization, that's not your path to the brass ring. You'll see, if you count, I suspect, that women are much more likely to be doing this kind of work, which means they have to literally work longer or they won't get ahead. So if women are doing disproportionate amounts of the office housework, how can you interrupt this? First of all, don't ask for volunteers. If it's an office housework task and you staff it by asking for volunteers, the women will be under strong informal pressures to do it, to be a good team player, to be helpful. And the men actually will be under equally strong informal pressures not to do it. We did an analysis of a law firm once, and the one time a man had volunteered to do one of these kinds of things, he was criticized for not knowing what it took to succeed there. The women were doing tons of it and praised to the skies for it, but of course, it did not lead to promotion. In terms of administrative work or literal housework, the logical thing to do is either with a literal housework to allocate it to admins planning the holiday party, or to establish a rotation. Everybody at a certain level rotates in taking the notes. For undervalued work, if you see a woman getting stuck in this, and they often do, it's important to help her develop a transition plan, to use what we call the strategic no, which means to go out and get some highly valued work, and then the next opportunity that comes around to work on the paperclips committee, to have her say, you know, I have really loved paperclips. It's been a stretch for me these 6 years. But now I'm working with Tim on this major new grant. So I don't have time for paperclips, and to help her think through who she could suggest for paperclips, for whom it would actually be a good opportunity, someone much more junior, typically. And then have her go and try that. And you know what? It might not work. Because we receive persistent feedback that when women try this, sometimes it works, and sometimes they just literally can't get out of paperclips. And so then you may need to intervene and to go and say, you know, Jane's done great on paperclips. Paperclips is history for Jane. Here's Tim. Now he's paperclips. The other effect of the tightrope is that it's literally a tightrope. To get ahead here at MIT, you have to be so aggressive. But if women here are too aggressive, then they're ostracized. And if they're not aggressive enough, then they have to do twice the work. And there you see the intersection between the prove it again and the tightrope. And this tightrope actually is even narrower for Asian American women. They receive, in STEM, they report far more pushback, far more pressure to behave in feminine ways, and far more pushback if they don't than any other group of women. But it's true for all groups of women. Because of those prescriptive stereotypes, women often feel they have to choose between being liked but not respected if they're modest, self-effacing, and nice, or respected but not liked if they're direct, assertive, outspoken. That's the tightrope. Sometimes called the likability competence trade-off for women. So if women are these adjectives and they're associated with masculinity, often they're seen as having personality problems. Here's an example in a STEM environment. A young woman job candidate showed some impatience in the face of some questioning after her seminar, which alienated some people who oppose her now, despite her stellar credentials. A male candidate showed similar impatience, but no one mentioned it. In fact, he's the leading candidate. This kind of thing happens a lot, so what can you do if you see it? You can just say mildly something like, gee, I wonder if we're being consistent here, or how is that different from what Jeff did? These are other things that women who are direct, outspoken, assertive, competitive. She has sharp elbows, what a witch, she really threw off the handle, she's a real self-promoter. All of these signal that women are being sanctioned for not being modest, self-effacing, and nice. And so again, you can just say, gee, I wonder if we'd be saying the same thing if she were a man. Showing anger tends to increase the perceived status of a man, but decrease the perceived status of a woman. So if aggressive bullying behavior is tolerated, then there's a certain demography to that, because you can bet your boots that it's not going to be accepted from women, and it's going to have a profound effect, of course, on workplace climate for everybody. Self-promotion is also an extremely important gender difference. Women get penalized for self-promotion. This is another example of how prescriptive stereotypes are a matched pair. So women get penalized for self-promotion. Men, they get penalized for modesty. Men aren't supposed to be modest. They're supposed to be competitive, ambitious, assertive. And so modest men are seen as having less leadership ability, ambition, and confidence, and more feminine qualities. They're seen as weaker, more uncertain, and insecure. Now, this modesty mandate also affects Asian Americans very profoundly, and also class migrants, people who grew up in a blue-collar background. So your department relies heavily on self-promotion in order to get the word out about accomplishments. You notice that there's a very specific demography on who self-promotes. How can you intervene? Well, one is not to rely on self-promotion. The other is to limit self-promotion to formal contexts and tell people explicitly what's affected. For example, if you have a self-evaluation, you need to tell people specifically what the task is. Otherwise, the tone will be different from one group of self-evaluations as compared to another, and that will differ depending on demography. You can also set up alternative systems for self-promotion. Some department chairs, for example, in academic environments send around a monthly email sharing people's accomplishments over the past month. Keep in mind, though, one of the reasons that women don't self-promote is that they will receive pushback if they do. And that just is, again, an example of how the kind of informal systems that have been, that have grown up are designed around what's socially appropriate for men. Here's the third pattern. As you can see, it's less common than the first two. 59% of the mothers I interviewed report it, but it's much stronger, much stronger. When my friend Shelley did one of the early studies, she was so excited, she called me and she said, "Joan, this is fabulous. Look at this effect size. I have been studying gender for 10 years. I've never seen anything like it." And this is what she was talking about. Identical resumes, one but not the other a mother. The mother was 79% less likely to be hired, only half as likely to be promoted, offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. These were identical resumes, management consultant, and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. This is prove it again squared. Motherhood triggers very strong negative competence and commitment assumptions, even if the person's behavior has not changed at all at work. This is actually a comment from one of my blogs, an online comment. He said, "Let's get real. This is a real disadvantage and a risk when women get pregnant. So, given the same qualifications, I would rationally go for a man. Not saying it's right, just saying it's logical." How do you respond to that? I mean, as someone who has run an organization for the past 15 years, and I had had them count them, 7 maternity leaves, including one right now, I tell you as an employer, are they a pain in the neck? Yes, they're kind of a pain in the neck. It would be far more convenient if workers never had babies. And it would be even better if they never had bodies, because that's a pain in the neck too. They get sick, they disrupt the lab. That's how you respond. Some of this maternal wall bias is benevolent, of like, I didn't staff you on this matter because I knew it wasn't a good time for you, what with the 2 young kids. That's called benevolent prescriptive bias. It's in a nice tone of voice, but you notice how the message is, a good mother wouldn't want this opportunity. So that's the prescription, the should. Here's a gentle version, still waiting, still here. Your babies will be waiting. Your babies are waiting. Work will be here in 20 years when they'll be long gone. Again, a comment that's benevolently meant, but sends a very strong message about what's a socially appropriate family role, not the role of an employer to send. So you've just gotten a large grant and are assembling your team. A colleague would be perfect, given her research background and interests, but she just returned from maternity leave, so the schedule will be really intense and you're not really sure what to do. What do? You call her into your office and you say, you know, you would be perfect for this team. For you, it would be the next step. But if it's not a good time for you, just say so. These things come around from time to time, and make sure they do. And you know, in this day and age, it's really important to do that not only to women when they come back from parental leave, but to men when they do. Because there's been a revolution in the workplace that stems from different generational attitudes towards what it means to be a good father. In my generation, if you showed up at the ballet recital, wow. Now, many younger men feel that being a good father means being involved in the daily care of their children. And if you don't allow that, they will leave. And so this is very important, not only in terms of retaining mothers, but in terms of retaining men. And then there's also a study that shows that mothers who are indisputably competent and committed tend to be disliked and held to higher performance standards. If she can do all that, does it mean she's a bad worker or a bad mother? And you notice that there's a different tightrope that operates in the maternal wall context. That leads us to the 4th pattern. It's called the tug of war. You can see it's the least common. In the survey of scientists, 75% of women responded roughly like this. They said, women in my environment generally support each other. The older women are always very encouraging, very helpful, and very kind, although interestingly enough, only 56% of the Black women agreed. But here where the problems come in. I've heard that a lot. Women don't want to be associated with our women's group. They want to stay in arm's length because they don't want to be seen as one of the complainers. So instead, they align with the men. This is an example of strategic distancing. I sometimes call it, why would I want to hang out with losers, right? Notice how you're distancing yourself from the out-group and aligning with the in-group in a politically savvy way. Now, sometimes these women are called queen bees, as if this was a personality problem. This is not a personality problem. This is an ambitious and politically savvy woman operating in an environment of gender bias. Then there's the loyalty tax. She didn't like the things that were going on, but she accepted them and refused to stand up in any way or even admit publicly that there was a problem. In certain environments, particularly STEM and particularly engineering, the loyalty tax is very, very strong, where women are put under a lot of very subtle pressure to say, oh no, there's not a problem, there's not a problem. And we've just actually completed major surveys of the legal profession and engineering. And this is not very strong in the legal profession, and it's very strong in engineering. Here's another example. Opportunities for women here are very zero-sum. So if one woman gets a prized position, another one won't. And so it breeds a sense of competition. Then the other forms of bias can be passed through woman on to woman, particularly in environments of gender bias. Here's the prove it again pass-through, where women hold each other to higher standards because she struggled a lot and had to work extra hard, and so expects women to have done as much as she has. The goal was to have women achieve high standards, so there's no criticism. So you notice how this is a response to perceived prove-it-again bias in the environment. This is another prove-it-again pass-through. It's from admins to women. This actually was a study of legal secretaries. Female lawyers are harder on their female assistants, more detail-oriented, and so they have to try harder to prove themselves. So they put that on you, said one secretary. So you notice now how the prove-it-again problem is creating conflicts between the professionals and the admins. There are other environments where the admins kind of police the professionals into office housework or other kinds of feminine behavior. So if there are freighted relationships among the women, ask yourself whether they reflect gender bias. Make sure there's not just one woman's spot, and send the message there's no one right way to be a woman. Most important, don't make it politically costly to advocate for women. There was just another recent study that showed that people who advocate for diversity often pay a career price for doing so. Make sure women are getting equal administrative support, and make sure everybody's life outside of work is respected. So what I have given you now are things individuals can do in real time to interrupt bias. And many of them work for race as well as gender, as I've hinted. The real answer, though, is that if there's a diversity problem in an organization, it's typically because these subtle forms of bias are constantly being transmitted through the basic business systems, through hiring, through assignments, through performance evaluations, through promotions. And so the real answer is to change the business systems. And in a 2014 article in Harvard Business Review, I introduced a new model of organizational change designed to do exactly that. It's called metrics-driven bias interrupters. Although my Harvard Business Review editor said only someone from San Francisco could like that name. But we like it, right? Evidence-based, metrics-driven. And so it's received a lot of attention. It's basically 4 steps. If you think there's a problem, do what I did. Just recite the findings of the social psychologists and say, hey, any of that going on here? And develop a hypothesis. But then, of course, the women may be wrong. So you need to develop an objective metric to measure to see whether what they think is happening is actually happening. If it is, then you need to put in place a bias interrupter, which is basically a tweak to the organizational system that in an evidence-based way is designed to interrupt the bias, and then return to the metric and see if the situation has improved. And if it hasn't, I guess you have to try something else. So it's basically using the sort of iterative, metrics-driven procedure that we use to solve any problem that we actually care about. So I have time, I think, for some questions. Or comments?
I'm just curious, because a couple times you mentioned looking at identical resumes or two people with the exact same qualifications. How is that even possible?
They're lab studies. They're studies in the college social psychology lab. So they recruit subjects and they give them identical resumes.
Oh, I see.
Either Greg Jamal, if it's a race study, or mother, non-mother, if it's a motherhood study. And many of these are lab studies.
In the recommendation letters that you talked about for women, you mentioned something called doubt raisers. Can you define what a doubt raiser would be?
I wonder if she's really committed. Would be a classic doubt raiser, especially for a mother.
Your intervention steps were gentle and subtle. And I wonder why, rather than a direct approach trying to correct behavior.
Yeah. Well, I mean, partly in the book from which this stems, called What Works for Women at Work, we have a range of interrupters, all the way from mild-mannered, which is what I focused on today, all the way up to robust. So, for example, in the stolen idea, I gave you the mild-mannered of, been thinking about that ever since Pam first said it. You've added something important, a little flattery there, never hurts. Here's the next step, right? One of the people I interviewed, when the stolen idea happened to her, she just looked straight at the guy. She said, "Is there an echo in here?" Right? That is robust. What most people need is the mild-mannered. Because if you're going to do robust, God bless, go in peace, do it. But for most people, that's going to be spending too many political points. We all have a lot of different ways we want to spend our political points, and we only have but the number that we have. And so most people, they're not going to use the robust ones. But they're all, if they appeal to you, they're all in the book.
Good morning. I agree with basically everything you say. And
That's a good start.
Yeah. Well, I want to, I'm on your
Oh,
side.
I thought you were finished.
I have seen every situation you describe regarding bias in the workplace, and I've especially seen that at Argonne. So it's clear. But I see you put the situation in some of your slides in the form of men versus women, or men compared to women. And I'm not exactly sure what you mean when you say things like women get penalized for self-promotion, men get penalized for being modest. So, as a scientist and mathematician, et cetera, we, often like precision in our statements. So, and also I should say I feel a little taken aback because, being a man, I don't always see myself reflected in what you were saying. So just for the sake of clarification, should it be interpreted that you mean sometimes women get penalized for self-promotion, or all the time they get penalized, or we should be on the lookout for that? And the same applies to the men versus women situation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
fair enough. These are tendencies. And So women can tend to get penalized for self-promotion, men tend to get penalized for modest. I just don't, I admit the tend to, because it doesn't sound as cool, frankly. But all of these are merely tendencies. So what you have is, for the men get penalized for modesty, you have, again, a lab study where a man comes in and he goes like, I really smashed that. And then you measure the response to him. And then you have a man coming in and saying, I think I might have some good things to offer to this team. And I don't really want to blow my own horn, but this is some of the kinds of experiences that might be relevant here. And that's the effect. So, and it's not universal, for sure, but that's the tendency. And so, I mean, the next logical step is to say, these are lab studies, right? These are, I sometimes call these disrespectfully the 40 white college student studies. Like, all that tells you is what 40 white college students think. What's that relevant? We actually now have, I've boiled all this down to a 10-minute survey, and we have results from engineering, comparing men to women, for engineering in general, and then we also have results from a major STEM research organization, because we work with a lot of them, comparing men to women. And on virtually every single, I was completely stunned, every single one of the patterns that I've talked about here, you have very strong levels of statistical significance in actual STEM workplaces comparing men to women. So, this is a general talk, and I'm not assuming you as an audience, but I've totally got you nailed as an audience, right?
I'm a lawyer, so I have a two-part question and an introduction.
Well, I'm going to put my lawyer hat on now, take my STEM hat off.
The intersectionality between gender and race and other characteristics you touched on a couple of times in your presentation. So I'm wondering a couple of things. First of all, are there particular combinations of traits that tend to really magnify the issues that are dealt with by an individual who has those traits, first of all? And second, particularly when people can draw a lot of inferences just from a person's name about certainly their gender and and potentially their ethnic background, and especially when you're in an organization that places a great value on personal knowledge or extended personal knowledge of someone's reputation, how, especially at the recruiting stage, can you moderate that tendency to infer certain traits about a person just based on their name? So.
Well, very easy. If you're looking at a lot of resumes, at the resume stage, you should be holding what's called blind auditions. You should be bleaching all of that out at the resume stage. Now, at a certain point, you can't bleach that out anymore because you need to talk to a real person. And then there are other bias interrupters. These are the organizational interrupters that we're developing now through the Bias Interrupters Working Group. But if you're ever in an environment, well, ever in a situation where you're looking through lots of resumes, you should be holding a blind audition. It's easy and it's very effective. And there are companies now that actually do this, and they are doing things like getting people with community college degrees jobs at Google because they're holding blind auditions rather than just looking who went to MIT. And I say that as someone who went to MIT. So on the first issue, it's complicated. I mean, before we did the work that we do on the intersection of race and gender, people just said, well, if you're a woman of color, it's worse. That's actually not true. For example, black women are allowed to behave in more dominant ways than white women are before they are sanctioned. Again, tendency. Everything is a tendency. So, no, it's a fair point. It's a totally fair point. I appreciate it. Now, of course, at a certain point, there's like this drop-off where if you're an angry black person in the workplace, raise your hand if you think that's a great career move. Now, you wouldn't be in here if you thought it was a great career move. So, so it's the intersection of race and gender is really complicated. For example, Asian Americans, of course, it may help you get the job because everybody knows that Asians are so good at science, but it will not help you gain a leadership position because everybody knows that Asians have low social skills and no leadership ability. So these are, and I'm talking about stereotypes, I'm not talking about truths, right? Just got that science thing going on, so I want to make it clear. And so the configuration of gender, advantage, disadvantage, and race, advantage, disadvantage, and their interaction. Just one example about Latinos. Latino women scientists, that's Latina scientists, tend to get really high levels of office housework and of a very menial sort. I mean, we have Latina scientists being expected to fill out grant paperwork for their male professor colleagues and expected to schedule meetings. Not to mention that the Latinas and blacks were, even in white lab coats, were mistaken for janitorial staff. So that's not something that ever has happened, that doesn't happen to white ladies, right? So they're complicated interactions, but what I feel I have developed for the first time is a methodology for really teasing out some of those differences. There's a gentleman in the back. Just didn't want to have a back front bias.
I think most people are familiar and can identify gender, race, ethnicity pretty clearly, but you mentioned class migrancy. So I wonder if you could further define that and discuss how to uncover that and if some of these same biases apply.
Okay. Yeah, being a class migrant is really important because typically it's like white people are privileged, people of color aren't. Is that true? People who grow up in blue-collar backgrounds, no matter what the color, are often disadvantaged in the workplace. For example, in blue-collar families, this is stronger in Asian American, but it exists in black families, white families, Latina families. There's a really strong modesty mandate. There's an expression in Spanish, calladita te ve más bonita, which means you're prettier when you shut up. That's a classic Spanish phrase, and there's an equivalent Spanish phrase for men. And so what you have is people who grow up in, white people who grow up in professional managerial families, they grew up with a sense that the kind of behaviors that are rewarded in the professional workplace were socially appropriate. People who grew up in blue-collar or low-income environments, the match between what their communities see as socially appropriate behavior and the kinds of behavior that are accepted in the professional workplace, it just isn't as good. And self-promotion is a really, really good example. But there are a lot of others. Actually, I study gender and I study race, but I also study class and coined the term class migrant to point out that people who grew up in low-income or blue-collar families, in some ways they assimilate if they become professionals, but in some ways they're always different. And that also is an axis that we have to really be aware of in the workplace, because it's an axis that affects not only people of color and women, it also affects white men. And a lot of, some of the things that also happen to women, I mentioned, also happen to men who are introverted, men who are very shy or have trouble speaking up. They're not direct, outspoken, assertive, and competitive. What kind of a loser? So the axes, the bottom line is, if you change the workplace in a way that's going to help women and people of color, it's going to help a whole range of people. It's going to help class migrants, it's going to help men who are introverts. It's going to help LGBTQ people who do not self-present, men who don't self-present in a masculine way. So I hope that's helpful. I think I'm getting the cane. Thank you.
You're done? Thanks again.